Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's probably just after midnight. And he's just woken up the 11 disciples because Judas obviously is not there. Judas is meeting with the chief priests and elders. And Jesus says the time of betrayal is upon us. And immediately before Jesus even finished talking, a large crowd with clubs and swords approached the group. And Judas, having told them, "The one whom I kiss, he is the one, seize him." So Judas walks up to Jesus and he says, "Hail, Rabbi." Rabbi means teacher. And Jesus says, "Do what you're going to do." And Judas kisses Jesus. And Jesus says to him, "Friend, is this how you betray me, with a kiss?" And then the chief priests and elders who were there with the clubs and the sticks and the soldiers grabbed a hold of Jesus. Peter reaches out with his sword and strikes one of the slaves that is with him and cuts off the man's ear. And Jesus says, "Stay your sword. Put your sword away. This has to happen to fulfill the scriptures." So Jesus reached out his hand and healed the slave's ear. Jesus looked at the chief priests and elders and said, "Have you come out with clubs and swords to arrest me? I sat with you this whole past week in the synagogue, and you didn't do anything like this. But now that scripture should be fulfilled, I am Jesus the Nazarene." And they seized him, and the disciples fled. One account calls for a young man who was following behind Jesus wearing nothing but a linen sheet, and they grabbed him, and the man pulled free and ran away naked. So now we come to the Jewish trial, and Annas, who is the father-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas, Jesus is brought before him, and he's questioned by Annas, and then he's bound and sent to Caiaphas, the high priest. So during this discourse, Peter is in the courtyard, standing at the doorway, and the servant girl says, "Aren't you one of the 12? And Peter's like, No, you're mistaken. I am not one of the 12. They asked Jesus a few questions. And so Annas says, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus finally answers, after being silent for all this trial. And it's just before sunrise. And Jesus says, "You have said that I am." So Peter's sitting outside warming himself by the fire. And the crowd comes up to him and says, "You too were one of the 12 and you were with him." And Peter's like, No, I wasn't. No, you're mistaken." But then the chief priests start yelling at Jesus and saying, "This man has blasphemed." So they tie him up, they slap him, they spit on him. And then Peter is outside the court now. And the crowd starts saying, You were one of them. You're with him." And Peter starts to curse and deny it, and denies it adamantly, and says, No, I'm not." And he uses some profane words, and immediately the rooster crows. And Jesus looked over at Peter and made eye contact with him. And Peter remembered what Jesus had said and started to bitterly weep. At sunrise, they delivered Jesus to Pilate, who was in Jerusalem. Pilate was a Roman ruler. They believed that they had from their little mock trial enough evidence to put Jesus to death, because Jesus said he is the Son of God. This was, in their opinion, a blasphemous statement and could not be tolerated, and it was deserving of death. So the Sanhedrin, which is a group of religious leaders, the chief priests and the elders, bound him, blindfolded him, and delivered him to Pilate, to the Roman courts. So Judas, the betrayer, was given 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. And Judas went back to the chief priest and he tried to return the 30 pieces of silver. The chief priest said, "That's not our problem. Go away, we don't care." So Judas threw the 30 pieces of silver on the ground, scattered it all over, and he left. This is the sad part for Judas. He knew that he did something wrong. He betrayed God's own son. He went out to a lonely place and he hung himself. He killed himself. And now Jesus is standing before the governor. His name is Pilate. And Pilate questions him. But Jesus remained silent, and Pilate was amazed at this. So Pilate comes out and he announces, "I find no guilt in this man." He announces this to all the people, to the chief priests and the elders. And the chief priests insisted that Jesus was stirring up trouble. He was accused of things like telling the people that they didn't have to pay taxes. Now, if you remember earlier video, Jesus was very clear: give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. But now he's being accused of telling people that they shouldn't pay taxes. So Pilate sent the trial to Herod because Pilate had heard that Jesus was from a different city. So now Pilate's going, well, I can get out of this. I can just send him over to Herod and have Herod take care of it because he's not from my city anyway. So this is an easy out for me, because Pilate didn't want to do anything to Jesus. He couldn't find any guilt in him. So Herod questioned him for a while, and Jesus remained silent. But when he was in Herod's custody, he was mocked, he was spit on and slapped and all this other stuff. But they put a big fancy robe on him and they sent him back to Pilate. And until this point in time, Herod and Pilate were not friends. But at this very moment, they became friends. I'm not sure why that's in the Bible. That really stuck out to me, and I'm going to have to do some digging to figure out what the significance of that is. But Herod sent Jesus back to Pilate. Now, it's the custom on this day during the festival that Pilate, the governor, is to release a prisoner from the prison in honor of this festival. So Pilate has this man named Barabbas who's like the worst of the worst criminals. He's an absolute scoundrel, what some people might refer to as scum of the earth. So he brings Barabbas and Jesus out and he says, which of these two men should I release? Barabbas, who is hated by you guys, or Jesus, who is just making the claim that he's the king of the Jews? Well, the chief priests and elders, they stirred everybody up and got the entire crowd to start crying out in a loud voice, Barabbas. So Pilate now has to release Barabbas. But then he asked the crowd, well, what should I do with this man, Jesus, who I find no guilt in? And the crowd starts yelling and screaming at the top of their lungs, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. So now, because Pilate's afraid of the crowd and starting a riot, he decides, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to wash my hands of the whole situation. The people cried out and said, that's fine. We'll take responsibility for it. Just crucify him. So Pilate had him scourged. Now, scourging isn't just a beating. It's not just a whip. It's using thongs of leather with claws and pieces of bone and little knife-like objects tied in it. And it would have
It would have been ripping the flesh, but not causing so much damage that he could bleed to death. They were very good at this. They could whip him to within an inch of his life, but not cause death. So that's what they did. They beat him, and then Pilate turned him over to be crucified. During all this, Pilate's wife sent a message to Pilate and said, I had a vision, a dream about this man. Have nothing evil to do with this man. This man is innocent. He's a righteous man. Pilate was questioning him for the last few minutes, and Pilate asked a specific question. He says, so you are a king? And Jesus says, I am, but my kingdom's not of this world, this realm. And then Jesus continues and he says, for this very purpose I was born, to testify to the truth. And then Pilate looks at him and says, what is truth? What is truth? The leading authority in the entire universe on truth is standing before you. You ask him, what is truth, in a mocking way, as if to say, there's no such thing as truth. Sounds like our world that we live in right now. The idea that truth is in flux and flowing, and you can make your own truth, your own determination. Think about that. So now the trial's over. They're sending Jesus off to be beaten and mocked. They're going to beat his head with rods. They're going to put a crown of thorns. Now these thorns aren't like rose thorns. These are long, perhaps 2 or 3 inch long thorns. And they're going to fashion this into a circle and call it a crown. They're going to place it on Jesus' head. They're going to drive this crown of thorns deep into his flesh using rods and beating him on the top of the head, on his back, spitting on him, kicking him, doing whatever they can to try and humiliate him. And they come across a man named Simon of Cyrene. They find this man, Simon of Cyrene, and the Romans put him into service to carry the cross for Jesus, because obviously Jesus is so badly beaten, he can't even drag this cross any farther. They gave him wine mixed with gall. Now this gall, from the best I can figure out, is like a narcotic to deaden the pain while he's dying, which is in some ways pretty humane, to try and take away some of the pain from these criminals when they're being crucified, because crucifixion is the most painful way to die. It's slow, it's agonizing, and it strikes fear on it. And I'm not going to get into the details here because it's so far beyond what we could even imagine. Crucifixion was so cruel and so inhumane that Rome actually outlawed crucifixion because it was too brutal. That's pretty crazy when you stop and think about who Rome was and how they really didn't care. So Jesus has been so badly beaten that he can't carry his cross, or he is going to be brought to Golgotha, which is translated the place of the skull. The soldiers have divided his garments and cast lots. So that would be to fulfill Scripture. We go on, and there's 2 men, one on each side of him, that are also crucified with him. And they're both mocking him. But at some point, the one guy, he says to Jesus, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise. The guard is standing in front of Jesus, and he's watching all this happen. And he says, truly, this was the Son of God. This man has seen hundreds of people die. but nothing quite as astonishing as this man who's nailed to a cross. He says he's the Son of God. There's something unique there. The veil in the temple is torn in two from top to bottom, not as a bottom to top like a man would tear it, but as God would tear it from top to bottom. That's an important part of the verse too. The earth shakes, rocks split, tombs are opened, and it gets dark. Now the Jews demanded that these robbers, these criminals, this Jesus be taken down before sunset because the Sabbath is the next day. And remember I said the Sabbath starts at sundown. So they want to get these people off the cross before sundown so that they don't hinder their Jewish Sabbath. So the Jews demanded that Pilate break the legs. But when they got to Jesus, Jesus was already dead. Jesus was already dead, so they took a spear and shoved it into his side, and the blood flowed out like it would out of a dead man, not out of a living person. This proving that he was dead, but it also fulfills the prophecy that not a bone in his body shall be broken. Lots of prophecy being fulfilled today. Stick with me because we have some final words of Jesus. And we're going to be presenting those in just a moment.
Luke 23, 33, and 34. When they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on the right and one on the left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them because they know not what they are doing." And they divided his clothes and cast lots.
Luke 23, 39 through 43. Then one of the criminals hanging there began to yell insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other answered, rebuking him, "Don't you even fear God, since you are undergoing the same punishment? We are punished justly because we're getting back what we deserve for the things we did. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "I assure you, today you will be with me in paradise."
John 19, 26 through 27. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple he loved standing there, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her into his home.
Matthew 27:46. About 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
John 19:28. After this, when Jesus knew that everything was not accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, he said, "I'm thirsty."
John 19:30. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." Then bowing his head, he gave up his spirit.
Luke 23:46. And Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit." Saying this, he breathed his last.
So as the sun's setting, we approach the end of this long, painful day for Jesus. And now they're going to take him down off the cross, bring him to a brand new tomb that nobody's ever been laid in. A prominent member of council who was not consenting to the treatment of Jesus like this, a man named Joseph of Arimathea, had a brand new tomb that nobody had ever been laid in, and he asked to take down the body and bring it to his new tomb. So they wrapped Jesus' body in clean linens to prepare his body for burial. They had to do this before sunset because, well, that's the Jewish Sabbath at sunset. So as you can see, it's almost sunset. And as this video comes to a close, we should stop and reflect and think about the last few moments. I hope you've enjoyed this. There will be another video, and I hope to see you then. Until then, until next time, God bless and good night from the Hazards.